First of all, let me introduce myself. I'm Alexis Papahelas. I'm the executive editor of Kathimerini. I'm very glad to be here among old and new friends. And I think this is a very exciting conference. I never thought, we're going to bring this together, but thanks to Simeon Tsomokos and the Delphi Forum, we have managed to pull it together, which is quite something. And I think a round of applause for him and the organizers is important. Now, I think Senator Van Hollen doesn't need an introduction. Most of all of you know who he is. The only thing I would say is that he has been a very trusted and reliable friend of both Greece and Cyprus, and we're deeply indebted for that to you. And the first thing I want to ask you is, could you unlock the mysteries of how foreign policy is being decided these days in D.C.? We have all evening, so,
I assume that, given all the earlier panels, somebody must have come up with the magic answer to that. Look, I think that's a matter of speculation of a lot of people looking in at this administration and the chaos. How does foreign policy making even work in the White House? That being said, there are some patterns. I mean, you do see some clear patterns with this president, and I don't think it's a partisan statement. I think you just have to look at who he feels most comfortable with in terms of other world leaders. And there's no doubt that he's demonstrated an affinity for those with more authoritarian sort of tendencies, those that see the law as more of a nicety than as something to be observed. And you can see that in his very cozy relationship with everybody from Erdogan, of whom he said he was, quote, a huge fan or a big fan just within the last week, Putin, Kim Jong-un, and others. And the overall pattern as it translates itself into policy is an administration that really has no patience and real interest in our alliances, calls into question our commitment to our NATO partners, essentially launches economic battles, not just against our economic adversaries, but against our partners, and really wants to run the world as a series of bilateral deals, as opposed to a more principles, values-based foreign policy that we've traditionally had. So what that means at the end of the day is you can wake up any given morning and not know exactly where the United States stands on any given issue, because the reality is that foreign policy comes out of the White House and specifically from the president. And people can do a lot of careful preparation, but that can all be thrown out the window at the last moment.
No, I mean, we've noticed that a lot of the institutions have been traumatized by tweets, criticisms, and so on. Is this like a long-term kind of thing? Is it going to be reversible if Trump is not reelected?
I think this is an anomaly. That doesn't mean that there aren't risks that sort of the national conversation and the way it's conducted could see some changes going forward. But I do believe that this particular sort of manner of behavior is an aberration. I certainly hope so. What you've seen, for example, coming out of the hearings on the Hill right now, and I'm not going to get into the substance at this point in time, but just in terms of how the president has treated a series of witnesses, career foreign service officers, career civil servants, most recently someone who works for the vice president, is to attack their character, question their patriotism, which is, I really hope, an aberration, because these are folks that are serving their country. We have a number of foreign service officers and other civil servants here. I want to thank them for their service. And that undermines, it undermines morale. It also undermines U.S. foreign policy in a significant way. And when you've got a president on the phone with a foreign leader undermining and bad-mouthing a U.S. ambassador to that country, that's corrosive. And unfortunately, we're seeing a very harmful impact right now, not only in terms of the current morale at the State Department, but also a big drop-off on the number of people who are taking our foreign service exams. So I'm hoping this is an aberration and that we can return to some normalcy in the coming years.
I know that you've had very good relations with the other side of the aisle, both at the House and now in the Senate. I mean, I wonder what has happened to the Peter Luger, John McCain kind of school of realism and the enlightened Republicans in terms of foreign policy. Are they just scared to speak up?
So let me say that the first major piece of legislation, national security legislation the Congress passed shortly after President Trump was elected was the CATSA legislation. It was legislation that put tough sanctions on Russia for a variety of reasons, both its conduct in Ukraine and other places, as well as interference in the U.S. elections. That was a big bipartisan vote. And that was early on in this presidency. It passed by a veto-proof vote, and in the end, the president signed it. I do think that that legislation sort of reflects the bipartisan consensus in the Congress, and I think when it comes to standing up for NATO and reasserting our commitment to NATO, you're still seeing that on a bipartisan basis in the United States Congress. We reformed a NATO observer group that I participate on. We invited the Secretary General of NATO to give a joint address to the Congress. So Congress has taken a number of steps to push back on the President's efforts to undermine the NATO alliance. That being said, on a whole range of other issues, you're not seeing you're seeing our Republican colleagues, unfortunately, being more worried about being on the wrong end of a tweet from the White House than sticking up for what have been sort of, bipartisan principles in foreign policy.
Do they say something different behind closed doors?
Well, I think the answer is in the first year and a half, yes. Now I think there's this exhaustion that is set in. And so I will say that Republican senators, when they're sort of quietly confiding in you, yeah, they'll admit to some of the craziness in foreign policy. I mean, the most recent thing, which also provoked a big bipartisan uproar, probably the most intense I've seen in the last 3 years, was the President's decision to throw our Syrian Kurdish allies under the bus, the Syrian Democratic Forces, the coalition. That provoked a very strong response. Now, the President has been trying to bring some of those Republican senators back into the fold by having them over to the White House when he invited President Erdogan here. But that was a genuine sort of bipartisan response, saying this is sending the wrong signal to the world and certainly to our allies around the world, and comforting our adversaries at the same time when you throw under the bus a major ally in the fight against ISIS. So you still see on the Hill some of that consensus, but in terms of action, you saw the House act with sanctions legislation, but right now Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader, is acting as a shield for the President when it comes to holding President Erdogan accountable for his actions against the Syrian Kurds and refusing to allow a vote. If we had a vote on that in the Senate, it would be a big, big majority.
Really? Okay. Let's talk about the Syrian debacle. If you can tell us, in your view, what are the geopolitical consequences of that, and how do you explain that decision? Because it was a very personal decision, right? It was not a...
It was. Look, you had the President of the United States on the phone with President Erdogan, and when they hung up the phone, Erdogan, launched his attack against our Syrian Kurdish allies, and at the same time, President Trump tweeted out that we were, removing our forces, our special forces that had been acting as a deterrent in that part of the Syrian-Turkish border. No, I think the Economist had it right. In fact, I actually brought it right along here. Here it says, who can trust Trump's America? The consequences of betraying the Kurds. And I think that sums it up very well, because this was a moment where the question is whether we're going to stand by the folks who had really worked with us at the tip of the spear to put ISIS on its heels, not knock it out entirely, but certainly put it back on its heels and geographically, remove it from that part of northeastern Syria. And so the message sent was, even if you're our strong ally, even if you have lost over 11,000 of your fighters, men and women, in successful fight against ISIS, we're happy to throw you overboard and throw you under the bus. And that sends a terrible signal, not just to our allies in the region, but around the world. And it will take, in my view, a long time to recover from that. And it's part of the repair work that needs to be done.
Who are the winners from that debacle, in your opinion? I mean, when you look at the...
Well, you have a series of winners. Obviously, Erdogan's a winner because he was able to take this action, not only get away with it, but then get an invitation to the White House, right? I mean, how many times do you have a situation where a foreign leader undermines American national security interests, throws an ally, attacks an ally of ours, makes a deal with Russia, and I'll get into that, they're obviously a winner here, and then says that and then this is Erdogan, says he's going to, assassinate the commander of the SDF forces right after they helped us collected information that allowed us to get Baghdadi, right? And so normally, with that set of facts, you would have somebody trying to hold President Erdogan accountable, which was what the purpose of the sanctions was. Instead, you get an invitation to the White House. So what kind of message does that send? And then at the White House, essentially, President Erdogan shows a bunch of videos and hands the president back the letter the president sent him. And on the way home says, by the way, we're going to keep the S-400s. So who wins from that? Erdogan wins. Russia has won on a number of levels. I mean, Russia wins because right after striking the deal with Pompeo, Erdogan turned right around and said, well, okay, we're going to strike a better and different deal with the Russians, with Putin, and look, we all know that Russia already had significant influence in Syria, so it's not like we handed them, new influence, but we certainly expanded their leverage in Syria, especially in northeastern Syria, where our presence provided us with more leverage. The other winners are Russia because, at least for now, despite the actions the Congress took with respect to the F-35, the president has not imposed any CAATSA sanctions on Turkey, which are required, and Erdogan has not backed down on the S-400. So you have a NATO country buying an advanced Russian air defense system that does put our pilots at risk, which is why we blocked the F-35. We, the Congress, really blocked the F-35 transfers. The other winners are Iran, because the extent that we reduce our leverage in Syria, that's a net win for Iran, and obviously Assad is a winner. So you've got that constellation of winners, and the United States, and I would argue its allies, who've been supporting our efforts along with the Syrian Kurds, are the losers.
Now, besides Trump, there seems to be a debate here in this town about Turkey. There are people like you who say that Turkey needs some tough love or some sanctions, to straighten it out. And there are others who are really worried that, Turkey will drift away from the West, and they don't want to have the who lost Turkey debate, let's say. Is that an accurate description of what's going on?
I think that's a fair description of what's going on. I think Turkey is testing the alliance as to whether or not that's where it sees its future, or whether it sees its future somewhere else. I think there's consensus that we would like to keep Turkey within the NATO alliance. Historically, it's been a very important partner within NATO. It currently has forces in Afghanistan, and so But that being said, in addition to attacking our Syrian Kurdish allies and giving ISIS new oxygen, having allowed ISIS fighters, by the way, to transit through Turkey for years and years as ISIS grew, you know, Erdogan has a very cozy relationship with Putin. The S-400 purchase was an example of that. And so my view is, if you look at President Erdogan, that it is important to hold President Erdogan accountable. The wrong strategy is simply to say every time, you know, he cozies up with Putin, say, okay, that's okay. You know, we're so worried about you going all the way that we're not going to take any action to defend our security, in the case of the S-400s, our allies, our other allies, the Syrian Kurds in the case against ISIS. And if you don't push back at all, it will just, it will encourage Erdogan to continue to flout his commitment to NATO and the alliance, and also further embolden actions, which you probably talked about earlier today, in, you know, the Eastern Mediterranean and around Cyprus with respect to oil and gas deposits within the EEZ of Cyprus. So my view is that you've got to stand up and hold them accountable, but also make clear that, you know, we do want Turkey to remain within the alliance. Look, Erdogan's, you know, the economy's not great in Turkey, so, you know, people debate, you know, what impact U.S. policies will have on Turkish public opinion, but I can tell you that the main thing that Erdogan has his eye on, in my view, is how the Turkish economy is performing. And so actions that can be taken that could pressure his economy are things that I think he takes seriously.
Now, it's a bit confusing with us what's happening with the sanctions that you had introduced in terms of both the F-35s and also, you know, in terms of the S-400s. Could Erdogan get away with actually making those S-400 operational? I mean, do you think the sanctions are going to happen, or do you think the White House will find a way to, you know, to escape from that?
So I think this was part of the conversation the president wanted to have with Erdogan when he was here in Washington, and he invited some Republican senators down to join him. I haven't seen any sort of positive result from that. The only thing I've seen is Erdogan's statement on the way back to Turkey, that it was important for him to maintain his strategic relationship with Putin and Russia. You know, there's an ongoing conversation about substituting the Patriots for the S-400s. I will say that the decision with respect to denying Turkey the F-35, I mean, that has been made. And, you know, the appropriations bills, the defense bill that we're working on right now has money in it to transfer the part of the, you know, the part of the work that was being done in Turkey to places outside of Turkey. So long as they proceed with the S-400, they will not be part of the F-35.
And there's no way around that.
I'm sure President Trump is constantly looking for a way out of that, but that is in the legislation that's pending right now, and I think you would see a bipartisan uproar if that changed. And it's in the defense now. The bill's still in conference, but that is baked in, I think, right now. Now, the question on sanctions is a very different one. You know, President Trump is looking for every way not to impose CAATSA sanctions on Turkey right now. And with respect to the sanctions on the Hill, as I mentioned earlier, look, the House passed, I think it was 403 to 16. I mean, this is a massive veto-proof vote, bipartisan, obviously, out of the House of Representatives. You would get a similar result even today, I believe, if you put that up for a vote in the United States Senate, which is why I say Mitch McConnell is protecting, you know, Trump from that decision. And, you know, making the argument that you raised, which is that will just, you know, it will further alienate Erdogan, and, you know, but, you know, in my view, you've got to draw some clear lines here. Again, make it clear that we want Turkey to remain within the NATO alliance, but there's certain rules you have to abide by. One is not buying an advanced air defense system from your primary adversary. I mean, at least, I mean, the reason NATO was formed, of course, was originally to, you know, deter Soviet aggression, and so it's a little contrary to think of a NATO partner and ally buying an advanced weapon system from Russia.
Now, as you probably know, the asymmetry in terms of defense capabilities between Greece and Turkey has grown. And this is also due to the fiscal crisis in Greece. At the same time, US-Greek relations have been at the best, you know, the highest level, you know, for a while. Do you see any appetite on the Hill for maybe some sort of, you know, FMS assistance to Greece to buy, you know, US defense equipment or anything like that, of that nature?
So, and we have both ambassadors here, and I want to thank them both for their good work on behalf of both Greece and the United States. And as you say, I think we do have very strong relations between the United States and Greece right now, and they're at a very strong point. We have obviously very strong defense cooperation, and efforts at Sudo Bay are expanding, as well as other locations within Greece. All that's important. We did, and I pushed for it, and we got bipartisan support for increasing the IMET program. In terms of, you know, FMS, we have to see. There's no current major move to do that. That doesn't mean that, you know, we couldn't look at certain kinds of arrangements. You may have talked about it earlier, but there is the legislation that removes the arms embargo on Cyprus. There's some conditions that can be met, and they're also waivable by the president. So I think you do see, as your question indicated, a lot more cooperation and defense cooperation between the United States and Greece. You know, we'd have to see about the FMS piece.
We're not there yet.
Not there yet.
Okay. Now, you've been involved with these issues for a long time, since you were a staffer on the Hill, right? A Greek prime minister always knew that if there was a crisis in the Aegean, he could call the president here, and, you know, somebody, Dick Holbrooke or, you know, Clifford in the old days, somebody like that would appear and become an honest broker. Who does a prime minister from Athens call now, and what kind of response is he going to get?
An honest broker here in the United States?
Yeah.
Yeah. First of all, let me say the reason Alexis knows that I worked on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee before I ever thought of running for office was because that's when we became very good friends, when he was here working for a different publication at the time. And I should also point out my wife, Catherine, is here, and she worked on the House Foreign Affairs Committee at the time. So we used to have the House Senate Foreign Relations, House Foreign Affairs, you know.
You were not my sources.
Back and forth. We're not your sources, that's right. So the question is, who would be the honest broker here in the United States for the Greek Prime Minister, for Mitsotakis? Well, the reason it is a difficult question goes back to your very first question, right, about foreign policy making out of this White House. It's really difficult for anybody. You have a lot of people who are potentially very good, honest brokers. The question is whether they can deliver on, you know, what they say. And I think the challenge is that nobody has the ability to be able to deliver. I mean, obviously, anytime someone's in a negotiation, ultimately the President of the United States, from the executive branch, ultimately the President of the United States has to weigh in. But, you know, in this current environment, it's hard to know. Now, there's still, I would say, there are lots of folks that people can use as channels of communication, but ultimately, at least with this president, if we're talking about communicating with this president, that's a very difficult question for the reasons we discussed earlier. And I don't have a really good answer. So if you were, for example, were to imagine some kind of tensions rising in the Eastern Mediterranean over, you know, the EEZ, which I think is, and you probably discussed this earlier, is a much more of a flashpoint than a lot of people around the world appreciate, you know, unless you're very focused on these issues. That could become a serious flashpoint. I don't know who at this point would be able to resolve that, within this administration.
The last thing I want to ask is, I think it's in a lot of people's mind, is who is going to win the primaries and what's going to happen in the election next year?
So, I go to every Tuesday, I go to a caucus lunch surrounded by at least six people who are running for president. So, or we may be down to 5, but we may have one more. I can't remember, I keep track. But look, I think we're all following these elections very closely. It is still too early to predict who's going to emerge from the Democratic primaries. One question is how long this primary season will go on. It could go on for a very long time. Historically, whoever comes out of Iowa, if they then win New Hampshire, they're kind of off to the races. But there's some primaries that are front-loaded that didn't used to be, like California. So, and you have so many candidates in the race that it could go on longer. What I will say with respect to the presidential election, the general election, is I really don't want anybody to show me another national popular poll. The Democratic candidate for president last time won on election day the national popular poll, right? I mean, Secretary Clinton won the popular vote. So this just comes down to about 6 states. And so, in fact, I was looking at analysis the other day that it could come down to like 6 counties in 6 states. The reality is we have to focus on the electoral map until we come up with a system that gets rid of the Electoral College, which I support getting rid of it, but we're not going to get rid of it before November 2020. And so those are the you got about 6 states that will determine the outcome of this election. And it's really important that whoever the Democratic nominee is be one that can win in enough of those 6 states to deliver an Electoral College victory.
And do you share any of these concerns that your party is moving a bit to the left and is not as mainstream as it should be in order to appeal to middle-class voters?
I think let's just see how all of this shakes out right now. I mean, you have this competition of ideas. You have a lot of candidates in the race. You have, people who are on the more progressive, on the more left side. You also have, a number of moderate candidates. So let's see how it all shakes out. I'm not going to make any predictions now. That's what these primaries are for, is to test different ideas and see where people are. And having been through a lot of primaries and general elections, it can be hard to predict. But I think people are looking for a candidate who, and this doesn't really answer your question, but both has a vision for the future for the country, but also somebody who can bring the country together. And in the Democratic Party right now, you have a debate that there's some folks that are much more focused on the first part, like how are you, what do you want to do to push the country forward really fast, at least by their definition of progress, versus those who also want to move the country forward, but are focused on a return to normalcy a little bit more. So that's kind of I'd say the sort of big juxtaposition right now.
Thank you very much, Chris, and hope to see you
thank
in
you.
Delphi next year.
Good to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you.